Hi there, and welcome to Military Histories, a podcast from York Army Museum. Each week we share an interview from the Royal Dragoon Guards audio archive. Throughout March we have been sharing interviews about family life. You can find more details about the Royal Dragoon Guards Oral History Project in the show notes. If you want to find out a bit more about our museum, there are links to our website and social media channels in the show notes too. In this final interview on the theme of family life, you can hear Mrs Joan Boardman, whose husband served with the 5th Inniskilling Dragoon Guards. Thanks for listening.
I was born in a little mining village in Northumberland on the 25th of October 1925. We moved to Ashington, a bigger mining town, when I was about 9 years old. But various left school at 14 and started work helping my aunt in a village called Felton, and then gradually came home and started working as a waitress in a cafe until I was 17, because I wanted to be a nurse and I had to be 17 years old before I could go. And it was during this period that at a dance one night with my sister, who was already in the ATS because she was 4 years older than I was, and she was on leave, and we were at this dance when we met a group of soldiers, and one of them was Jim Boardman. My sister was a very friendly girl. She already had a boyfriend in one of the Scottish regiments, but she invited all these boys down to tea the next day. My mother never knew who she was having for tea on a Sunday, but she made them all very welcome, and this group continued to come to the house, even if my sister and I weren't there. And so the friendships, one of them was married, and they called him the older man, poor soul, because he was only in his early 30s, but in those days, a 30-year-old was an old man to us. I'm very shy, and he was a great friend of my husband's. And they, as my mother used to say, she hoped that someone was doing the same thing for her children, because my brother was in the RAF in a way, training to be in Bomber Command, and my sister was away. And then, of course, I went nursing, which I always wanted to do, but unfortunately, after about 8 or 9 months, I began to think that it wasn't for me. I was paying more attention to the pain on the patient's face than I was listening to the instructions I got. In the meantime, we corresponded, my husband and I, well, my husband-to-be, which I didn't realise at the time. We were just friends. However, he, as I said, always came to the house with his friend. And he used to say to me, "You don't write very often." And I used to say, "Well, if you go abroad, I'll write to you every day." And of course, when D-Day came, I'd already left nursing. My brother didn't want me to join the WAFs, which I said I would do. And we had to do something for the war effort when you reached the age of 18. And so I said, well, I'll join the ATS. And from where I applied for that, and the day I went for my medical in Newcastle, I'd had to leave Ashington quite early because it was an early appointment. And when I got there and having the medical, the doctor said to me, "Oh, I thought your heart would be beating a lot harder today, faster today." And I said, why is that? Is there something wrong? And he said, no, but haven't you heard the news? Our boys have landed in Normandy. And my first thought was I must get home quickly because John was on leave. And of course the news bulletins were going out all the time that if anything happened, he knew that if anything happened, they had to return to base immediately. And this is what happened, and I missed him. And I didn't know I was not going to see him again. However, I went into the ATS and continued, and did keep my promise and wrote to my husband every day. And then eventually, when the war ended, he came home on leave and realised, of course, that it was just more than friendship. So we got engaged and then married in the March of 1946. I didn't realise at the time that I was committing myself to the army for life. However, there we are. It's he went off, and then in the August of 49, there was, or perhaps it was July, I received a letter from the War Office to say that they were allowing 50 wives to live in quarters in Germany to see, as an experiment, to see how the Germans would react to married families living in Germany. And then 50 wives went out. 2 of them they went to various regiments, and 2 came to the Inniskillings in Gremmendorf in Munster, York Barracks. One was an officer's wife, Mrs. Pat Chapman, and the other one was a sergeant's wife, Sergeant Swift's wife, Zena Swift. And then about 6 weeks later, I got a letter saying, perhaps it was less than 6 weeks, and various forms because my husband had applied and he'd been given a job. He'd been given a job in as an officer mess caterer, and there was a flat that went with it. And the quartermaster had said to him, if you took this job on, you could get your wife out because of the flat. So necessary forms came. And originally, actually, it was only supposed to be for a month because at the time they thought the regiment was going to India. And this is why my husband took the job, because he was going to have to look after the mess silver. Or something like that. However, I did go out on the 2 days after my 21st birthday, the end of October. And it took nearly 3 weeks to get to Germany because it was a day's travel to London, to Tilbury. And we boarded the Empire Halliday, I think it was called. And eventually went to Cuxhaven. There were 5 wives with us, 2 officers' wives, which was Mrs. Whetstone and wife of Major Whetstone, and Mrs. Carr, plus children and a nanny. Major Carr was the 2 in command, second in command of the regiment. And in the group also, there was on the train was from Cuxhaven was a Mrs. Joan Lomas with her son, and Michael, and Mrs. Mill Rundle with 4 children. Despite my experiences in England, where I had done several months of nursing and 2 years in military service, the scene of devastation which awaited us in Munster was a sight I will never erase from my mind. Just rubble and devastation. Having lost my eldest brother during a bombing raids over enemy territory, I had little sympathy at the time. On arrival in Munster, it was a mixture of joy and bewilderment as we travelled to Gremendorf, carefully negotiating the rubble and the bomb holes and crossing the bridge over the Ems-Dortmund Canal. The bridge had been destroyed and only a pedestrian section was in use. Fortunately, it was just wide enough to permit a jeep to cross, but only just. We were in the flat above the officers' mess, which was furnished with a standard army furniture, except that the kitchen was without a cooker. This meant that the first 2 or 3 weeks our food was brought up from the mess kitchen, which was very nice. Once the cooker and the necessary equipment arrived, we received a weekly supply of army rations, which consisted of bags of loose flour, sugar, oats, dried egg, dehydrated onions, and powdered potatoes, pom, as it was called, dried milk powder. The rations of butter and tea and sugar and meat were excessive to the measures found in the UK. We did have tins of carnation milk also, which made a big difference to the powdered version of milk. Sometimes a form of small flatfish made a change. We would have called them dabs at home. From the meat, which was usually made a change from the meat that was usually as tough as old boot. Fortunately, there was an abundance of game in the area, and there was no restriction for the British on shooting or fishing. Our lives, in contrast to the living standards of the local people who had very little food. The German currency had little value as there was so few shops and less supplies. We had our own currency called BAFs, British Army Forces Vouchers, I think they were, which could only be spent in the NAFI or the messes. There was a small bakery shop outside the barracks where queues would form daily for a small portion of bread, if they were lucky. We all employed domestic help who would willingly work for some commodity in the food line, mostly coffee, cigarettes and tea, which they would sell on the black market. A young girl who worked for us, Goethe, was also applied in the officers' mess, and she had a 3-year-old son and had fled Stettin and the Russian zone to live with relatives in Gremendorf. She had no idea where her husband was, or even if he was alive or dead at that time. The Germans all German workers in the barracks had their bags searched at the guardroom as they left in the evenings. So we had to devise a plan to give help in the way of food for Goethe and her little boy, which we could, as our rations were very liberal and at times too much for 2 people. We didn't have a NAFI store at that time, our nearest being a small town called Berg Steinfurt, which only stocked cigarettes, coffee and spirits in the early 1947. A larger NAFI was, in early 1947, a larger NAFI was available to us in Osnabrück. But of course we needed transport to reach it. By means of lifts in various army vehicles, we had been able to reach Berg Steinfurt, 20 kilometres away. However, a 3-ton truck was converted in type of a bus, which was used to take us to Osnabrück, and this would break down on many occasions. In the extremely cold winter of 1946-47, we would dress in all sorts of garments to keep warm in these journeys. Even our husbands' tank jackets were used as knee wraps. However, we survived, and we only had to look around to realise we were much better off than the people near us. At the beginning of 1947, when it was confirmed that I was pregnant with our first child, we decided that living above the officers' mess was not going to be very convenient for everyone concerned. So my husband was re-employed as a quartermaster's in the quartermaster's department, and we moved out of the barracks to one of the flats which had been taken over from the Germans for the British families. The name of the street, which I found very interesting, I didn't realise it at the time, was called Gustav Tuerweg, named after a very famous First World War pilot. However, years later, when we visited again, I noticed that there was no sign of it there. Do I go into town? No. And the NAFI had not yet reached the stage where clothing could be bought. So in April of 1947, we made the trip back to England. This time, the train line had been repaired, so we were able to travel to the Hook of Holland and then take the ferry to Harwich. Lovely to return home, but then there was the problem wasn't solved. With the simple shopping expedition, queues for clothing coupons and searching for a shop which could supply us with a bulk order. It's very hard to imagine that today. It had been, in those days, everything was in short supply, and the shops were only receiving quotas on a monthly basis, and we couldn't shop monthly. However, eventually we came to an agreement with a store in Newcastle called Bins, and they would put items to one side each month to give us a necessary layout for the coming baby. And this included amount of wool which we couldn't buy otherwise. Even in the local wool shop at home, my mother wasn't allowed wool because I wasn't there. You know? It was amazing, really, because in the end I ended up with new woolen clothes because all the relatives got cracking, and somehow managed to get an ounce of wool here and there, and did things for my it was amazing, really. But the actually bulk shopping that we did at Bins, which was just 3 of everything, and the napkins, of course, nappies, of course, only arrived a few days before, 2 weeks before David was born in 1947, in August 1947. The firm itself had to apply for an export license before they could deliver them, before they could send them, which is hard to believe, isn't it, really? You know, but there we are. All army families came under the care of the military doctors, of course, in the hospital at Munster. The bomb damage to it had been repaired and was named the 24th British Military Hospital, Munster. I didn't see the same doctor twice till I was 7 months pregnant, and then a Czechoslovakian doctor, gynecologist, arrived on the scene, which was wonderful for by that time I was in need of specialist treatment, and our first son was born safely in August of 1947. Still no pram, and we were not in the position to obtain a second-hand one, living where we did. Goethe one day arrived with a wicker-type German pram, spotlessly cleaned up, Puffenwagen they were called, and it had been her son's. We put it in the cellar, but I knew I would never use it, although my dislike for the Germans were gradually being replaced by a strange sense of admiration and sympathy for these people. It had not gone far enough. To watch people through a harsh winter with little food and fuel, struggle in poor light, trying to rebuild their homes, sorting out bricks and usable from the rubble, and carry on as long as they could in the dark, and then to see the tree placed on the roof, which was their tradition. You just wanted to share their sense of achievement. Now 60 years on, which is more than that now, of course, with our own family of 5 children, 10 grandchildren, 3 great-grandsons and a great-granddaughter. These feelings I had as a young girl of 21 have been replaced completely. One of our sons actually married a German girl, a lovely girl, but after 15 years of marriage, she died of cancer, which was a great sadness to us all. We did, incidentally, going back, we did eventually buy a pram for that first baby. The Nafi were lucky enough to receive 2 or 3 from a Belgian farm and were able to purchase one. We were able to purchase one. Different, but it pleased my husband as it had a torsion bar for suspension, like the Shafi tank that he'd had during the war. We left Gremmendorf in the March of 1948 for a tour of duty with the Cheshire Yeomanry, and poor Gerda at that time had still no news of her husband, and we lost touch, unfortunately, with her. She used to go down, every so often. I can't quite remember how often it happened, but there used to be a train come into Munster station with prisoners of war, and she used to go down and hope that one day she might find her husband there. Apparently, I learned afterwards that the communications with the German army weren't very good at that time. Not surprised, really, because everything was in chaos. Our tour with the Cheshire Yeomanry was very good. Different. I stayed at home for 6 months with my parents in Ashington because there was no accommodation, no married accommodation. And in those days you couldn't even rent if you had a baby or a dog. But eventually we did manage to find 2 rooms in Hoole and Chester. And it happened to be fortunate, actually, because the couple that lived in it had no family. He was a traveller in children's toys and things. We never gave a toy to the baby, our baby. But she, fortunately, was a bridge fiend, if you call it, not a fiend, but a bridge addict. And so most days she was out playing bridge. So I did have the run of the house, really, the kitchen and things. That lasted for a few months, and my husband was given a motorbike one day and to look for 3 houses that they could buy at a reasonable price to have as married quarters in Chester, and one of them we had. So that was another experience. I'm given £200 to furnish it, which wasn't a lot, and not enough in those days to get the necessary equipment for a house. We enjoyed that. It was different. We were in a town, near a town, and not within walking distance of a town. And we were there till the end of 1949, when the colonel came over to visit the Cheshire Yeomanry and decided my husband was going back. Yes, in the October, I think it was of 1949, the Colonel had been visiting the Cheshire Yeomanry where my husband had been instructing, and decided that he needed a new SQMS, and that would my husband go back to the regiment to do that job. We did explain about, or my husband explained about that I was expecting another baby, and he said that that would have to be a move quickly, because in those days you could either travel 6 weeks before the baby was due or 6 weeks after the baby had been born. I don't know what the regulations are today, much different I should think. But so exactly 6 weeks before I went. In fact, it was quite funny really in a way, because when we got to Harwich on the journey back, the officer on the boat, or whoever it was, said to me as we went on board, and we had to hand our boarding tickets in, "Mrs Boardman, if you'd come tomorrow, I wouldn't have allowed you on my boat," for an overnight journey to the Hook of Holland, because of the 6 weeks. I don't know whether he meant it as a joke or not. I never did find out. But it was exactly the 6 weeks before my daughter appeared on the scene. And at this time we went back to Paderborn and into a quarter. 2 of the blocks in Paderborn had been requisitioned as married quarters. Block 11, I think it was, and Block 12. So these were flats, which had been converted from the barrack block into a quarter. So that's another experience, because they had a big corridor in the middle between the rooms, one set of rooms on that. And lovely for boys above us who had roller skates or something. The furniture looked like doll's furniture against the walls. But the nearest hospital then was at Rintel, and that was a very precarious journey in those days, because it was a very bad, heavy snow. These flats in Barker Barracks were very spacious, huge rooms. We had an entrance hall, which I've already described as wide enough for children with roller skates to go up and down. But we had quite a large bedroom, and then one very large bedroom, one very large sitting room, a dining room, and a smaller bedroom, and bathroom, large kitchen, of course, which is very big, really. Very, it's hard to describe them, really, in a way. And you had to make them as comfortable as you possibly could. I can remember, because we had the furniture was sparse, really. We made settees up with our boxes, our travel boxes, what do they call them again? Like crates, and made cushions, and that was our settees, which were very good, really. Improvisation. Fortunately, I'd been a miner's daughter, so I know all about improvisation. It stood me in good stead throughout my army life. Janet was born in Rintel in January of 1950. And my husband the transport was very difficult to explain, really. He'd only been able to visit me once, and then the next time he came up, because I went into hospital a week before Janet was born for various reasons, and the next time he visited me once, and then the next time he came in, I'd already had her, and the sister said to him, "Oh, she was very annoyed with him because he hadn't been before, but he didn't know I had Janet until he arrived." Very difficult to imagine today, really. But there we stayed in Barker Barracks till the announcement came that the regiment was going to Korea in 1951, it would be, yes, or 52, 51. And so, once again, no accommodation for wives was planned, which annoyed us immensely. And we were offered accommodation in a hostel in Corsham, in Wiltshire. And the RSM's wife at the time, no, not the senior W, I think she was, I'm not sure about that, but a few of us decided that we would accept this accommodation. But really, because the army would have to do something about us. The band, of course, didn't go to Korea, but they were allocated married quarters somewhere, and that annoyed us. But band-wise, but again, I must admit, when we got to Corsham, it was communal feeding. The accommodation was appalling. I was fortunate, and one of the Remy wives with me that went with me, we were both fortunate because we were allocated a newish type of rooms, one bedroom and one living room. I think there was a bathroom. Must have been, yes, there was a bathroom. The communal feeding was appalling. It was really dreadful. I can only describe it as appalling. I lasted a week and just sent a telegram home saying, fortunately I had the kind of parents that welcomed you home. I didn't have to say, can I come home? I knew I would be welcome at any time. I just sent a telegram home saying, I'm coming home. And my father sent a message back, of course we weren't on telephones in those days, saying, time of train, and he would be there. If he wasn't working, he would be there at Newcastle Central, standing waiting for me, because he would be saying to my mother, she'll never manage the journey home with the bairns and the luggage, which was a lovely feeling, really. When I look back, I was so lucky that I could do that, just say I'm coming home, and knew you would be welcomed with both arms there. And it was a miner's house with no bathroom, toilet outside. All the water had to be heated. But it's amazing how quickly you get back into the swing of things. But the love and the welcome with relatives and neighbours was so... I always feel as though I was so lucky to have that background and know that you're welcome and loved and cared for. And a lot of people, I didn't realise at the time, never had that. Even today, it's out of the question. life changes. Not always for the best, but we were lucky. And I stayed at home until the Korean episode. Oh, yes, it was in 1953. My husband came home on leave. The regiment had gone from Korea to Benghazi, to Egypt. And we were allowed a quarter. Not everybody was allowed, because we were only going to be there for a year. Well, it would be 6 months for us, because in the July, my husband came home on leave, and he went, 1 or 2 wives had gone out, but we hadn't had any notification. There was a quarter. We hadn't had notification by the time he came home that there was a quarter for me, rather. So he'd only just, it was the coronation year, and we'd gone down a few days to stay with his sister, who lived in Bromley, before he went back, and taken the children up to see the preparation. We still only had the 2 children, David and Janet, to see the preparation for the coronation. And then he went away, and I went back to Northumberland. When I got back home, there was the envelope from the War Office saying, if you fill this necessary forms in, you can go back with your husband. But that was too late. But exactly a month later, we were in Egypt. We went in July, the hottest month you could have possibly travelled in. We were given this quarter, which was on the Canal Road between Fayed and Chandler, where the regiment was stationed, about 20 miles away. It was no electricity. The plugs and everything were there, but the Egyptians, who were not very friendly, had cut it all off. But we did have a flush toilet, which was absolute luxury. And the amazing amount of people that used to stop when they'd come down to Fayed from Chandler to pick up supplies would stop, have a drink before they went out, carried on. And I think the sound of the flush toilet was such a lovely sound for them. I can remember one young officer sitting there with his mouth wide open when he heard the toilet being flushed. I couldn't believe it. It was amazing. But conditions there for children were not very good. They were not very friendly. It was so hot. I was so worried about my son David. He didn't eat a thing the first 6 weeks. And the MO he was just losing weight. And the MO said, well, as long as he keeps drinking, that's the main thing. It's the effect of the heat. And then one of the wives had gone into hospital with a sort of dysentery infection. So we had to share her children, really. She had 4 at the time, Mrs. Benge, and the RSM's wife up in Chandler. Helen took 2 of them, and I had the other 2. And the 2 boys were little rascals, really. Just boys, really, but I hadn't had that experience. And very difficult. They run across the main canal road and worried the life out of me, because that was the real traffic. You know, there was the canal road, and then it was on the back side of the Bitter Lakes, really. And eventually, but the blessing in disguise, really, was that through them, they ate everything. And David had his first meal, solid meal in 6 weeks, which was baked beans on toast. I've never forgotten it. So I had a blessing in disguise, didn't I, really? But, however, that's what we did. We shared the children. You had to do that. Otherwise, her husband would have had to have, I don't think you could get leave in those days, actually, just to look after your children. The schooling, that was very precarious because they had to go with an armed escort to school. And there was a little nursery school because Janet was 4. Well, she wasn't quite 4, actually. She was 3.5, I suppose, nearly. Used to call the truck that came for her, the young trooper that used to come to the door for her would have his rifle, but he had ginger hair, and Janet used to call him, "Has my ginger biscuit arrived yet?" To go to this. We lived on this, in this quarter. It was by the side of a canal, and it was called the Sweetwater Canal, and if you fell in it, you had to have so many injections. That's why it was called the Sweetwater Canal. A camel died. It was my eldest son, David, could never forget the sight of a camel that had died at the side of the road. Huge camel. And David never forgot, I think, his eyes, the eyes of this camel. However, there we are. It's another story. But we left Egypt. We were there just the 6 months. We left Egypt in the January, early January. I've forgotten the name of it. And I thought, oh, we'll have a lovely time sailing through the Mediterranean. We'd originally flown out to Egypt on an old converted York aircraft, which rattled and shook the whole way to Egypt, really. But coming back, we were coming with the families. And that's the most I saw of Egypt, was the fact as the journey in the coach from Fayed to Port Said, or was it Suez? Can't remember. And that's the most I saw of it, because we weren't allowed to go out without another vehicle as an escort, and we were limited to how far we could go. The crossing we had, which I thought was going to be wonderful on the Mediterranean, was the roughest crossing the captain had ever known. Entering the Bay of Biscay was as calm as a cucumber. And we arrived in Southampton on the Empire Orwell. My brother left it as he went out, my other brother, to Singapore. But going back to Egypt, we weren't supposed to be left alone. Wives weren't supposed to be left alone in the house, in the quarters. But they had formed camps, what they called camps. One was called Kensington something or other, with married quarters in them, and they were in a guarded fence round them. But we weren't there long enough to get one of those quarters. But I slept with a gun, and I would have used it, but whether I would have done any damage or not, I don't know. But I certainly would have used it in those conditions. I thought I was being very careful. The bedrooms were sort of on the other side of you entered the quarter bungalow and you went straight into a sort of living area, but the bedrooms were on either side of it. And if the children wanted a drink in the night, I would go across with this pistol in my pocket and a torch with a drink. And I thought I was being very good until years later I heard my son saying, of course my mother used to carry a pistol in her dressing gown pocket. I don't know how he knew because it would be dark. But it wasn't very pleasant. And then one night I got really quite panicky and decided that I couldn't stay the night on my own. And the children were at the house, the bungalow next door at a party. And there was a major there, lived in that one. I can't remember which regiment he was in, but they'd lived in Egypt for a long time to suit their son's asthma. The weather suited their son's asthma. So, and he said to me, oh, you'll be all right. I'll put the dog round the garden at night time like I normally do. And I said, no, I've just got this feeling. I'll go to my friend who's already in this Kensington camp. And but then again, I couldn't unload the gun. So I had to get him to unload it. I couldn't carry a loaded gun with me. I wouldn't have made a very good armed wife, would I, really? So we went to... there was a family...
Can I just ask you, Miss Paul, were you taught how to use this gun?
Yes, we had been... we were taught in Germany, actually, my friend and I, because we didn't quite know what reactions would be there. And I can remember my friend, her husband, Sergeant Swift, and Jimmy had taken us both on the range, on the rifle range, to show us how to use a pistol.
The pistol belonged to the army, did it?
Yes, I think so, yes. Yeah. So that's hard to believe, isn't it, really? But it did actually happen. And going back to Egypt, there was a family's bus that used to go around the married quarters. And it was on the opposite, there was a yacht club opposite us. So that's where we used to wait for the bus. And this particular night, or late afternoon, I went across with the children and the basket with night things in it. And there was a young RAF boy waiting. He'd been at the yacht club, waiting for this bus to go back to his camp. And we stood, and nothing came. So he said, well, if we walk along the road to the officers' club, we might be able to hail a taxi if it doesn't come. So we walked along the road, further along the canal road to the officers' club. But there was nothing came, so we did get a taxi and to drop him off. He gave instructions to drop him off at such and such a camp and then take me on to Kensington camp. And suddenly realised, of course, I was in a car alone with the children and an Egyptian driver. And again, that wasn't officially allowed. You had to have another car as an escort. However, I'd got there, and this camp was in darkness. There was a power cut. However, I found the house, and of course knew I'd be all right there with my friends. But when we came back the next day, the fly netting on the bungalow had all been cut in one of the rooms, so somebody had attempted to get in. What I should have mentioned about Egypt was that next to the bungalow there was a small field. When we arrived in July of that year, they were busy harvesting cotton. The next thing were melons. Melons grew, and they harvested the melons. And in the middle of them, they found a dead body. But the third crop, it's unbelievable in such a short time that a third crop were peanuts. And that was an education for the children to see, because they didn't realise that peanuts grew in the ground. In fact, I didn't. I didn't know they were harvested like potatoes. And it was the only free thing that we ever got in Egypt. My husband loved peanuts, and he sent David with a little bucket and some money. I've forgotten what kind of currency we used. And to ask, we kept watching him, of course, as he went along the field. It was only a few yards away, to ask for peanuts. And the man wouldn't take the money, but gave him the peanuts, which was lovely. I don't know whether David remembers that or not, actually. He might do. In January of 1954, we arrived back in Southampton. The whole regiment, by the way, had moved with us. Or we had moved with the regiment. They were heading for Catterick, but my husband was going to do a drill course, or perhaps it was a riding course. I'm not quite sure now. My husband was going to do a drill course for 6 weeks after his leave. So we didn't go straight to Catterick. We went straight back to my home in Ashington, where I was staying. I was going to stay with the children for 6 weeks, or perhaps a bit more, before going into married quarters in Catterick. The quarters there we were given, I don't know when they'd been built, way back in the Ark Ages, I think. They were wooden, sort of bungalow type. Again, awful quarters, really awful. They consisted of kitchen, living room, tiny, and 2 bedrooms, tiny. The bathroom was almost impossible to get in for anybody that was pregnant, which I did become pregnant. And my husband thought he would... we had a really big copper in the kitchen, which you had to heat with a coal burner underneath for hot water. So you'd get the fire going to heat the water in this big boiler, and then carry it to the bath. And by the time you'd done that and had your bath, you felt as though and cleaned it out, you were ready for another bath. But my husband decided he would paint the bathroom, and he did. Got into the bath after lighting the fire, and it all fell down on top of him. The paint that he'd used, which is not the type you get today, of course, but it flaked immediately and fell into the bath. So it was much easier to fill a big bowl and get washed, really, than it was to have a bath. But we managed, again, as we do. Eventually we were given a quarter in Wardrobe Crescent, which is still going pretty strong today. which we saw a few weeks ago. The regiment was, but there was several wives had to go straight into these quarters. And I wasn't the only one. They were pretty bad. Again, the quarter we were giving in Wardrobe Crescent had a funny fire arrangement. It had a perfectly good upstairs. We had the 3 bedrooms. One was big, 2 were small, but adequate, and a bathroom. In the living room wasn't very big. It had a very small, modern sort of type fireplace, which was supposed to heat this huge range, which was in the kitchen. The heat was supposed to come through there to heat. You couldn't really describe. I don't know how. There were several of us, so I don't really know how we managed sometimes, because this heat wasn't really. In fact, we all bought an oil cooker that you could sort of bring your vegetables or whatever you were cooking to a boil, and then they would simmer on this top of this cooker. And it was very hard work to keep. The size of the range was almost the size of the wall. I'd been used to a coal cooker at home, but nothing like this. I can remember one day making a cake and thinking I'd got it's hot enough to make a cake. And I went into the kitchen, and my husband was cleaning his kit up, which was Blanco in those days. Horrified to find that he'd opened the oven door to dry his Blanco kit belts on or something, and my cake was in it too. We had a water cistern in the kitchen with no lagging or anything on it. So that was all wasted heat, However, we were there till 1950. The end of 56, was it? 1957, the regiment was posted back to Germany, but we were going again for our second tour of duty to the Cheshire Yeomanry, and this would be to C Squadron, which was stationed in Birkenhead. My mother wasn't very well, so we packed up the quarter before Christmas and gone home to spend Christmas with them and to see to my mother. And Jimmy had taken over this quarter in Birkenhead, which is above the drill hall, where the Cheshire Yeomanry C Squadron had their quarters. So in January of 57, sorry, I'm getting confused now, 57, we moved bag and baggage, 3 children, to Birkenhead, to this flat. Very spacious flat, which looked out over the gasworks. And I thought, have I got to spend the 3 years looking at the gasworks? And then I just shook myself and thought, come on, Joan Boardman, you were born on top of a minefield. You can get on with life here. And that's what you did. You just got on and made the best of it. And it was one of my favourite postings, Birkenhead. their people were so fantastic. They were so friendly. A lot of the Cheshire Yeomanry were farmers and Liverpudlian boys, but they were Birkenhead boys, but they were so, it was such a, I don't know, it really was a pleasure to be there with them. They were good. And some of those friends lasted lifetimes with us. Even now, today, we get messages from the Birkenhead boys, the last of the ones that Jimmy actually enlisted into the TA. Years later, when he became secretary of the association, and its headquarters was in Chester this time, many years later, of course, we still had those contacts.
That's good.
The thing about army life is you make a lot of acquaintances, but my father used to always say, I can hear him saying, if you make one good friend in life, you're a very lucky person. And I used to think, well, I was a very lucky person because we did make more than one good friend. You mean lots of associates and lots of people you meet, but good friends we did have. And that was something I was always very pleased about with army life.
What came after Birkenhead?
Birkenhead, we went back to the regiment in I must get this right now, mustn't I? 1959, the end of 1959, we went back to the regiment again. At that time, my husband was thinking of leaving the army, actually, because of education reasons and settlements, and I think he was going through a period when he didn't quite know whether he wanted to stay in or not. And then again another visit from Colonel Tompkins, said he would really like him to go back because he could use him back in the regiment. Again, someone was leaving and he wanted to replace him. RQMS, I think it was then. And David, we got into boarding school because of his mixture of schools. Janet and David actually went to a real school in Birkenhead and not an army school. And Bernard, of course, who was the next one, hadn't started school. He was only a little boy. He was a boy of 4, nearly 5. So we went back to the regiment then, who were in Senelaga. Again, there wasn't a quarter for us. My husband went first, of course, and then in that time that was in September, beginning of October, he went back to the regiment and I went home again until a quarter became available for us. And went out in December, I think. Went back to the regiment. I went out in December of 59. A friend, one of the serving members was going on a 6 weeks course to England, and he kindly said that we could live in his quarter. I think he was in the Education Corps, attached to the regiment. And he said we could live in his quarter till one became vacant, because the person that Jimmy was relieving hadn't left, completely, stood in his quarter. So, and then eventually, we lived there for 6 weeks, and then the quartermaster got us a house in Paderborn. till the one in Senalaga became vacant. And so we moved into Paderborn, it had been a German, it was a German estate, really, but a few at the end of it were used as married quarters. So that was a very nice quarter. I think it was an officer's house, an officer's quarter. And a lot of the different regiments were there. Two American, because they just formed another battery or something. There was 2 American families up there too. So again, Bernard had actually started school in Senalaga. So he had to go start another one in Paderborn. They'd got another school in Paderborn then. So he used to travel to that. And Janet carried on in Senalaga till she went to boarding school in the September of 61.
And David?
David was still at the same school in Caterham.
Boys' school.
Boys' school, yes. Independent school.
And how long were you there, Senalaga?
We were there till 61, 60. What did you do then? Came back to Tidworth, didn't we? In 19... Gone back now. So life at Tidworth began with in 1962, and Jimmy was RSM. Our house was situated on the end of the parade ground, so that caused quite a stir some mornings because I would stick my, wrong thing to say, place the baby high chair in front of the window, and my young son Richard used to sit and listen to watch the band, and sometimes one day when it was his birthday, they struck up "Happy Birthday" to him. It was rather nice, and the married quarters some of them were brand new, which was, but again, after the wives had been used to central heating and in Germany, keeping them warm in a very cold winter was something new to them, and had to rely on a delivery of coal, which the army had to go and get some days when the weather was so bad, because we did have a very cold winter and everything got frozen up. Even the pipes in our house, which was annoying because the officers' mess was placed at the back. The RSM's house was placed in the front of the officers' mess, and you could see where the heating pipe had gone from the officers' mess, round the quarter of the RSM's house, across the barrack block, and into the soldiers' accommodation. You could see where the snow had melted, with the heat. So, however, once again, you survive. And from there, I used to be very much involved with the Wives' Club, which was a very nice thing to have, although some wives found it a bit boring. It was where we could all meet. And the Gurkhas were wives, we used to have Safa sales, and jumble sales, and the Gurkhas were stationed in the barracks not far away, and their wives used to come and always be first in the queue when we had a jumble sale. Very nice, friendly people. Then in 1960, the end of 62, my husband was commissioned into the Army Air Corps, and we left for Middle Wallop, which wasn't far away, into a new stage of our lives. We were in Middle Wallop for a few weeks when my husband and the squadron he was in were posted to Cyprus for 6 months with the United Nations, as trouble had started up there again. I stayed on in Middle Wallop, and Janet and David were still in Bernard. By this time, was still in boarding school. No, Bernard hadn't gone then. He was at school in Middle Wallop. At the end of... My husband was in Cyprus for 6 months, so I think it was at the beginning of 64. No, that's wrong. The beginning of 64, or the end of 64, we moved across to Netheravon. The end of 64, beginning of 65, we moved to Netheravon and into a quarter in Wexland Avenue, which was very nice. I'd stayed there. I'm missing something out, aren't I? We moved to, I had another child in 1966, and in 1967 my husband was asked to do a recruiting job for the regiment in Northern Ireland, so we went there, and again had a hiring in the Antrim Road in Northern Ireland, just out in Belfast. Well, Newton Ards, till there was a vacancy at Aldergrove for us in a quarter. The house in the Antrim Road was called the Pines, a big house which had been divided into 2 sections, at one time let off as separate sections. One had gas side, and the other side had electricity. And so the kitchen was split with electric cooking at one end and gas cooking at the other end. Both of them were in an appalling condition, so dirty. And I had heard of the saying of how people could brush things under the carpet, but I never actually thought it was a real experience, which I did actually have in the Antrim Road, where one day, lifting the carpet, there were ashes under the carpet. And I wasn't going to talk any more about my army quarters, but I thought I must just mention that, because being me, I couldn't live in just cleaning one half of it. It was quite a huge house, and once again, the toilet was so small that you could, if I'd been pregnant there, I would have never got in it. And I'm not exaggerating. The fuses went one day. My husband went to replace the plug, only to find it had been stuck together with plasticine. I don't know how we didn't escape. I don't know how we escaped that. However, eventually we were given a quarter in Aldergrove, which was an RAF establishment. Very nice house. And we stayed there during that period till we came back. The troubles were already beginning to flare up, although I gather from experience that they'd always been there, but they were beginning to flare up again. Pipes were being blown up, and sandbags were appearing in round married places, not the quarters, but in other establishments, like the mess and entrance to the grounds and things. And so we left Northern Ireland and back to Netheravon, again with the Army Air Corps, where we stayed till my husband left the army in 1970.
Okay, Mrs Boardman, thanks ever so much for that resume of your husband, the life of your husband. Perhaps I can ask you one or two questions now, more specific if you wish. I'll start off with what was social life generally like for you during those days?
Well, from the early days it increased greatly, and we had some very good occasions. We made a lot of social life in the beginning of my married life as an army wife between ourselves. In those early days back in Germany, we used to just I had a very dear friend who was a lot older than me, as two of them were, because they'd been pre-war wives. But we used to just have meals together, and then, believe it or not, we'll make a lot of people laugh, but we had Monopoly. But it's amazing how a game of Monopoly plus a dinner and a few drinks can be a very, very sociable occasion. And then gradually the dances were in the sergeant's mess in the beginning, and always were. Beginning very, very few, but gradually increased. And then the great thing was, my husband and I were married on March the 16th in 1946, and the regiment always had a ball on St. Patrick's Day or the nearest one to it. So occasionally it would fall on our wedding anniversary, which was another great occasion. I was born on the 25th of October, which was, as people in the regiment would probably know, was the anniversary of the balaclava. And I never thought, when my father used to say to me, balaclava, that's the anniversary of the Battle of Balaclava, it will help you in your history lessons. I didn't think I was going to be involved with it so much as to marry someone whose regiment always celebrated the Battle of Balaclava. So that was another anniversary, another very big social event. We used to have some very good dancers in the mess. Very nice people to have with us.
Before you joined your husband and you haven't got married, and before you'd actually become in reality an army wife, as it were, what was your expectancy of what life would be like? And did it turn out as you imagined?
I didn't think at the time when I got married that I was marrying into the army. It didn't occur to me. But I think it's been very good. It's had its hard times and its good times, but I was very fortunate. I was very fortunate indeed, because I made a lot of good friends, and there was always somebody there to support me. Especially when my husband was RSM, I found I had some very good friends to rely on that would help me out, because we didn't have family officers in those days, a lot of problems with wives and families had to be sorted out within the regiment, which would involve the colonel's wife and the padre's wife and the RSM's wife. On one occasion, way back in Germany, I think it was in, I can't give the exact year at the moment, but the regiment had been out on exercise, and there's always a sort of rear party left behind, but this time there'd been an accident, and one of the sergeant majors had been killed in the road accident, stopping the traffic while tanks were crossing, and some German car had driven madly and knocked him down. And it was quite late at night, and I was just had a bath, and in the quarter we were in, the bathroom window opened out over the front door, so when the doorbell went, I opened the window, and the colonel's wife at the time, who was, did I give her name? Colonel Murray's wife, was standing on the doorstep shouting, "It's Jim, there's been an accident." And I thought for one moment my heart sank. And then she hastily added, "Jim Garrigan." So I came downstairs, and she said, told me what had happened, and she said, "I wondered if you could go down and tell his wife." And I said, "Well," because she said, "I don't know her at all, and you do know who she is." She said, "The paymaster will come round and pick you up, because I've told him." And I said to her, "Mrs. Murray, I've got a small baby, I can't just, and another boy in the house, I can't just leave them." And she said, "Well, I will look after them." And I thought, well, they don't know you. If they wake up, if the baby wakes up, he won't know you. And but I said, I've got a solution. I went across to one of the other wives, who was, again, a German wife and a great friend, but they'd just come back from a posting in Northern Ireland. And I will get her to come and look after the children. So I went across, and she duly came across. And I went down with the paymaster to the other quarters to wait for Mrs. Garrigan, who was out. And I could hear her laughing with her friends as she came back, because she was great one for playing bingo and whist drives. And I thought, how am I going to tell her? So she greeted with me, "Oh, hello, Joan, what are you doing out here?" And I said, "Well, can we go in, Edith?" And had to tell her. And Major Connor said, "I'll make a cup of tea." And he made a cup of tea, and then it was one of the most awful things I had to do, I think, was break the news. He was such a man that was so full of life. They didn't have any children. Edith was a German wife, and she'd had a very difficult time during the war. And then I remembered then, of course, that another dear friend of hers, like another German wife, lived nearby, so I went to find her. And she and her husband came, because he'd been on the rear party. And I left them with her then. She did come back to Tidworth with the regiment, with her friends, and stayed with them for a while till she found somewhere to go. And she did eventually remarry in later life, in later times. And oddly enough, the second man she married looked exactly like the first one. It was unbelievable. I'd gone to visit them, some friends. I was going to stay with them, actually, not with her, but she was there. She came to visit them, and they warned me before she came in. She said, whatever you do, don't be too surprised, because we did get a shock when we met John, the new husband, because the resemblance between the two was so great. It's unbelievable. Yeah.
Now, let's just briefly talk, if we may, about bringing up your children
And they're
during your period with the army, and how it affected them, either socially or educational-wise.
That is one of the big points of restrictions in the army, of drawbacks in the army, is the education of the children, really. We got very worried when David reached the age of 12. Well, we'd had his name down for a school for about 3 years, actually. It was a new school that was built just outside of Ipswich for army children, not solely for army children, for children who were whose parents were living abroad. And but unfortunately, when it came to David's year, he was born what they call the baby boom year, and the school, although they'd reminded us each year, did we still want the name on the list, that when it came to the crunch, they had so many, they had to take the children whose results of their 11 plus had come through first, and Cheshire was the last on the list, and we were told there wouldn't be a place for him, which was a bit of a worry, a big worry in fact. But we were advised by David's headmaster at the time in Birkenhead to go down to the education authorities in Cheshire and see what they could do about it, because he says, your son has passed, he's got a place for a grammar school, and therefore he ought to be given one somewhere. And so we went, and they gave us some very good advice, actually, because we'd never had any dealings with boarding schools before. And they again provided, within a day, because this came at such a vital time, really, so late were the results in coming through, and my husband was due to be posted back to Germany in the October of 59. So we didn't have much time, and they gave us schools, within a day, that had vacancies, because with them being a baby boom year, they were very, very, the schools were filling up. So, and one, I wrote to 3, and my husband wrote to another 3. And there were only 2 that had vacancies of those 3, and one was Caterham Independent Grant School. And we got an interview there for David, and he was accepted after sitting the exam for their school. And so he stayed there for 7 years. Again, I must say that whenever I went home to stay for any length of time, the headmistress at my old school in Ashington, would always take them in for a few weeks so that they never, ever lost out. Be different. But I always we were always told, especially with Janet and David, that what they were low on in some subjects, the subject that they did was very good, was the one with, what was it? Oh gosh. The ability to, their general knowledge. That was it. Their general knowledge. And that had come through moving round. So that, in a way, was one good bright spark. David actually started school in Ashington when Jimmy was in Korea. And the headmistress said to me when he was almost 7 that he was very slow with his reading. And I thought, well, he's always so good with his reading. No, she said, we think he's got a photographic memory. And he knows exactly when the word comes on the next page. So that's how he fooled us. But she said, don't worry, Mrs. Boardman. She said, Winston Churchill didn't read till he was nearly 8, properly. So I walked out of the school thinking, oh, future Prime Minister. However, it really is a problem. And then Janet, of course, had to go off as well to boarding school when she became 11. And Bernard went to the Gordon Boys' School. And it did them, they needed that continuation. It's probably wrong. At school, really, that is the problem. I always felt as though David left home when he was 12. Not so much when Janet left, because somehow it's different in a girl's makeup, I think, that she always sort of clings to home. But she wasn't very happy. David was always very happy at boarding school, and Bernard. Janet wasn't very happy until within the first year the school said they were forming a riding school. And we grinned and thought, this is it, this will do it. And it did. Worked out well for her. But her school again went bankrupt when she was in her GC O-level year. So once again, we were stuck because the schools, we knew we were being posted again. And the school in Salisbury, which would have taken her in, meant that she had to go back and do another course in O-level before she could actually take the exams. And we didn't know what length of time we were going to be in Northern Ireland at the time when that happened. So she stayed at a local school till she took the exams. In fact, she never ever did take them because they missed her off the list. It sounds absolutely incredible, and why we didn't kick up a fuss about it, I don't know. But she ended up going to Salisbury Technical College for 2 years, and enjoyed the social life of it very much indeed. But in later life, she did take her O-levels.
Would you say, overall, your children have had a good education, despite these problems?
I think they have survived very well indeed and made the most of it. David especially, and Janet too, because she ended up going into the QAs and unfortunately didn't do the full course because she got married. But in those days that they had to leave when they were married. Nowadays they can continue and finish their training as a nurse, as well as being married.
Yeah.
But that's all a long time ago, isn't it, really? Right, yeah. So times have changed. Army life has changed very much so for the better. And I must say, I support them in everything they do, and well earned they are. And I felt like running into the street and shouting 3 cheers when the army choir girls got going. I thought, thank God, army wives have been recognised at last.
we end up then, please, Joan, by you briefly stating of your husband's postings, which of course affected you as well, which ones you perhaps enjoyed the most, and those perhaps you didn't, and why, briefly.
The enjoyment ones, I think, were really Birkenhead and Netheravon. Birkenhead because of the friendliness and the lovely people that we met and friendliness, as I said before. And Birkenhead, and Netheravon because it was just a happy place. It was just a lovely place to be. Yes.
And the places you didn't like so much?
That's it. Ireland, I think.
Ireland? Why was that?
I don't know. It was a lovely country. I did think the country was beautiful. And I think it was the first few months in Germany, I think, at the beginning, when it should have been a really happy occasion, newly married and in it. But I think it was just shrouded by wartime and unhappiness, devastation. But that would have been in our case, wouldn't it? I mean, that's...
Well, yes. Yes.
If the boot had been on the other foot, you wouldn't dare think about it. No, you couldn't imagine it. No. Anyway,
Well,
there we are.
Well, you've been ever so patient, and I
Thank
very
you.
much, Mrs Boardman. Thank you very much. Is there anything you'd like to finish off by saying?
Good luck, army wives. God bless them all. I think they have to put up with an awful lot, and especially today, in today's army wives, when their husbands are away so long and in such terrible situations.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Boardman. Thank you.